What if I told you that the god of thunder, lightning, fire, and war isn't Thor, the one you know, but a mortal king who once ruled with unmatched power? A king so fierce, his anger could summon storms, and his fire could scorch the earth? What if his rise to godhood wasn't written in the stars, but earned through betrayal, exile, and a divine transformation? The legend of Shango isn't just a tale of raw power. It's a story of redemption, divine justice, and a warrior's relentless journey to ascend as one of the most feared gods in history. This is the origin of Shango. In the heart of West Africa, within the fertile lands of Yorubaland, stood the mighty Oyo Empire, a civilization known for its power, wealth, and spiritual depth. It was a kingdom that flourished for centuries, its borders stretching from the southern savannas to the forested regions in the west. This empire, one of the most powerful in pre-colonial Africa, was not just a political entity. It was a living testament to the strength and wisdom of its people. The people of Oyo were proud, their rich culture woven into every aspect of their lives, from their elaborate festivals to their sacred rituals. At the heart of this great kingdom, in the city of Oyo, stood a throne that was not only the seat of political power, but also the center of spiritual authority. This throne was meant for a king who would wield not just authority over the land, but the very forces of nature. It was here that Shango, the legendary king, would rise to prominence, not just as a ruler, but as a figure whose name would echo through time as one of the most feared gods in African mythology. Shango's rise to power was not a mere accident of birth. Born as the son of Oranian, the first ruler of Oyo, Shango was destined for greatness from the very start. Oranian had united the Yoruba people and laid the foundation for a powerful kingdom, but it was Shango who would take it to new heights. His father's legacy, however, was one Shango would not merely inherit. He would have to prove himself worthy of it through his own actions, strength, and intellect. From a young age, Shango displayed traits that would mark him as a remarkable leader. His exceptional skills in battle earned him the respect of his warriors, and his tactical genius allowed him to defend Oyo against invaders and rival kingdoms. The sounds of war drums could often be heard from the battlefield as Shango led his forces into decisive victories. His leadership was forged in the fires of war, but it was his wisdom in governing that set him apart from other kings. As a ruler, Shango was known not only for his strength, but for his keen sense of justice. His people believed him to be the earthly embodiment of fairness, a king who balanced mercy and wrath with divine precision. Under his reign, Oyo thrived, its economy flourishing through trade, its culture blooming through art, and its military feared by neighboring kingdoms. Shango's reign was a golden age for the empire, but it was not without challenges. The grandeur of the Oyo Empire masked the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Despite his success, Shango was not universally beloved. His kingdom, like all great empires, was plagued by political intrigue and internal strife. The royal court, filled with ambitious advisors and power-hungry nobles, began to question Shango's methods. His temper, quick and often ruthless, left many in fear, even among those closest to him. He was a king whose judgment was feared, but his power was undeniable. Rumors began to circulate that his rule was too harsh, that his temper would eventually lead to his downfall. But Shango's true power was not just in his ability to rule. There was something more, something deeper, that made him unique. An untamed force that seemed to stir within him, linked to the very elements of nature. As he stood at the head of the Oyo Empire, something larger than politics was at work. The storms, the fire, the thunder, they seemed to answer his call. The people whispered that the gods themselves had taken an interest in Shango. And perhaps they were right. For Shango was not just a mortal king. He was a king marked by the divine. And as the clouds gathered over the Oyo Empire, the divine storms of fate began to stir. This is where his story begins, on the precipice of destiny, as a mortal king whose ambition, power, and divine connection would lead him to become something far more than human. Shango was on the cusp of a transformation that would change not just the future of the Oyo Empire, but the very fabric of existence itself. The world around him seemed to tremble with anticipation, for Shango's journey was far from ordinary. His name would be immortalized not just in the annals of history, but in the realm of gods. His transformation from mortal to divine was about to begin, and it would forever alter the course of the Yoruba people's destiny. Shango ascended to the throne of Oyo at a time when his kingdom stood on the brink of greatness, but also on the precipice of internal conflict. His father, Oranian, had established the foundation for Oyo's prosperity, but it was Shango who would take this legacy and forge it into something even more formidable. From the moment he took the throne, Shango set his sights on expanding the empire's borders, ensuring the prosperity of his people, and establishing his rule as one that would be feared and respected by all. His reign began with a series of military campaigns designed to secure Oyo's borders. The neighboring kingdoms of Benin, Ife, and the other Yoruba city-states posed a constant threat, and Shango's prowess as a warrior became legendary. Armed with his double-headed axe, a symbol of his strength, Shango led his forces into battle with unparalleled strategy and ferocity. The thunderous sound of battle could often be heard echoing through the land, as Shango's armies crushed all who dared challenge his reign. Shango's military genius was matched only by his courage. He did not send his soldiers into battle from the safety of his palace. He led them personally. On the front lines, his presence was enough to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. His power, it seemed, was not merely that of a man but something far more overwhelming, something that linked him to the very forces of nature itself. During battle, storms would often rage overhead, as if the heavens themselves were responding to Shango's will. His anger, fierce and unpredictable, became the stuff of legend, with lightning flashing whenever he struck down his enemies. But while Shango was a brilliant military leader, he was also a shrewd and calculating ruler. His victories on the battlefield ensured the stability of the Oyo Empire, but Shango's true strength lay in his ability to manage the kingdom's internal affairs. He established trade routes, fostering economic prosperity, and implemented laws that maintained order and justice within his realm. However, his methods were not always seen as fair by all. Shango's temper, a trait that had served him well in battle, often got the better of him in matters of state. His swift and brutal punishments for those who opposed him became the talk of the court. Nobles who disagreed with him were silenced, and traitors were swiftly executed without mercy. His judgment was absolute, and while the people feared and revered him, many of his closest advisors began to question the harshness of his rule. Despite the challenges he faced, Shango's reign was seen as a time of glory for the Oyo Empire. His military conquests expanded Oyo's territories, and the kingdom's wealth flourished through tribute and trade. The once small empire became a dominant power in West Africa, and Shango's name was spoken with both awe and dread. In Oyo, the king was not just a ruler. He was a force of nature, and his court became a center of power, attracting visitors from far and wide. However, the weight of leadership began to take its toll on Shango. As his kingdom grew, so did the tension within his court. Power struggles began to emerge, and dissent within the ranks of his own people became more apparent. While Shango had led with the strength of a warrior, he now faced the more subtle and dangerous forces of politics. His closest advisors, once loyal, began to turn against him, sensing that his increasingly erratic temper and strict rule might lead to disaster. Shango's impatience for those who didn't meet his expectations grew, and whispers of dissatisfaction began to ripple through the court. His reign, once marked by unity and purpose, was now clouded by suspicion and the growing fear of his wrath. His reign, it seemed, was at a turning point. The seeds of betrayal were being sown, and even Shango himself could feel the storm brewing within his kingdom, one that would soon become too powerful for even him to control. In his moments of reflection, Shango could not shake the feeling that there was something more to his destiny. He had ruled with fire and thunder, but a voice deep within him began to stir. one that whispered of a greater calling, a transformation that would take him beyond mortal kingship and into the realm of the divine. Yet, he was unsure whether he was prepared for what lay ahead. What would he have to sacrifice to fulfill this destiny? And could he, the mighty king, truly control the forces of nature within him? As Shango's reign continued, the weight of the crown grew heavier. His kingdom was thriving, its borders expanding, and its wealth increasing. But despite all his successes, something inside Shango began to stir, something that went beyond the responsibilities of ruling. He could feel it in the way the air would change before a storm, in the way his anger could bring a fire to the earth, and in the way his very presence seemed to command the forces of nature itself. The thunder, the lightning, and the fire. These elements were no longer mere symbols of his wrath. They were becoming part of him. It was during one particularly violent storm, when the heavens seemed to clash with the earth in a rage of thunder and lightning, that Shango first truly felt the divine power within him. As he stood in the palace courtyard, the skies darkened, and the wind howled around him. He raised his hand, almost instinctively, and in that moment, a bolt of lightning struck the earth, splitting a nearby tree in two. The storm didn't frighten him. It invigorated him. For the first time, he felt a deep connection to the storm, as if it answered his call. His anger had always been powerful, but this was different. The storm was no longer a symbol of his fury. It was a reflection of his spirit. Shango, in that moment, realized that his connection to the divine was not a mere coincidence. The gods had chosen him, or perhaps he had always been destined for this path. He was not just the king of Oyo. He was the chosen one to wield the forces of nature, to become a living embodiment of thunder, lightning, fire, and war. But this revelation came with its own burden. The storm inside him raged, and he knew that he could no longer ignore the power that surged through him. It would change everything. As his divine connection grew stronger, Shango began to notice other strange occurrences. When he grew angry, thunder would crack in the skies above the palace. When he was in battle, lightning would strike the weapons of his enemies, disarming them in an instant. When he called for justice, the fire of his fury seemed to burn brighter than before. The people of Oyo began to notice these strange phenomena as well, and whispers spread that Shango was no longer just a king. He was becoming something greater, a god. But with this newfound power came immense internal conflict. Shango had always ruled with strength, but now he was beginning to question the true nature of his power. Was this divine force a gift, or was it a curse? Could he control it, or would it consume him? The more he sought to understand his abilities, the more he realized that his destiny was tied to something far greater than the kingdom of Oyo. Shango sought counsel from the high priests of the Orisha, the divine beings who were said to govern the natural world. They had long watched over him, and now they saw in him the signs of a powerful transformation. The priests spoke of the ancient prophecy, a prophecy that foretold the rise of a king who would wield the elements themselves. They told Shango that his divine power was not a gift from the gods alone. It was his birthright, a part of his essence that had always been with him. Yet even as he embraced this new reality, doubt lingered in his heart. Could he truly become a god, and what would that mean for the people of Oyo? His fear of losing control grew with each passing day, and the forces of nature that he had once commanded with ease now seemed to rise up within him, threatening to take over. His thoughts grew darker, and his temper flared more easily, as if the very storm inside him was mirroring his inner turmoil. But even in his doubt, Shango knew one thing for certain. His destiny was inevitable. The storm would not be denied. He would become a god, not just of Oyo, but of the very elements themselves. It was only a matter of time before the gods would call upon him to fulfill his divine purpose. The prophecy would be fulfilled, and Shango's power would be complete. As the storm within him continued to build, Shango began to prepare for what lay ahead. He could feel it in the air. An approaching change, a divine transformation that would alter the course of his life forever. The king was ready to embrace his divine power. The warrior would become the god of thunder, lightning, fire, and war. But what price would he have to pay for this transformation? And could he still retain his humanity in the face of such overwhelming power? The winds howled, the thunder rumbled, and the flames of Shango's destiny burned brighter than ever. His journey to godhood was about to begin. Shango's divine powers, once a blessing, soon became a source of immense internal conflict. The storms within him grew wilder with each passing day. The more he sought control, the more they seemed to slip from his grasp. Thunder would crack at his command, and lightning would strike without warning, leaving destruction in its wake. As his power grew, so did his isolation. Those who once admired him began to fear the king who could summon storms with the mere wave of his hand. His fury, now amplified by the divine forces coursing through him, made him unpredictable, even to his closest allies. The kingdom that had once thrived under his rule now trembled in his shadow. Whispers of discontent spread through the palace, and his counselors, once loyal, began to question his judgment. The very advisors who had helped him expand the empire now feared the power he had become. Shango's temper, once an asset in battle, became a burden in his court. He would punish those who disagreed with him without mercy, using his newfound power to enforce his will. His reign, once marked by fairness and strength, was now defined by tyranny and fear. One of his most trusted generals, Ogunlai, a man who had fought alongside Shango in many battles, began to grow uneasy. The general's loyalty, once unwavering, began to falter as he watched Shango's transformation. He had seen firsthand the toll the power was taking on the king, and he feared that Shango was losing touch with his people. The divine power that had once seemed a gift now appeared to be a curse, and Ogunlai was not the only one who thought so. As Shango's temper became more volatile, his enemies saw an opportunity to strike. Within the walls of the palace, a conspiracy began to take shape. Ogunlai, once Shango's closest confidant, became part of a group of nobles who saw Shango's reign as a threat to their own power. They plotted to remove him from the throne, believing that the only way to save Oyo was to strip him of his divinity and bring order back to the kingdom. The betrayal came swiftly. One fateful night, as Shango retreated to his chambers to meditate and try to control the storm that raged inside him, Ogunlai and his conspirators struck. They confronted Shango in his private quarters, accusing him of being a tyrant who no longer cared for the well-being of his people. They claimed that Oyo had prospered under his leadership, but now, under his rule, the empire would fall into ruin. The nobles insisted that he step down and relinquish his power to them. Shango, enraged, could feel the storm rising within him. His body trembled with the power of thunder, and the walls around him seemed to tremble with the force of his fury. But even as the storm within him threatened to explode, something within him knew this moment had been coming. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The very people he had protected, the ones he had trusted, were now turning against him. With a roar, Shango summoned the full force of his divine power. Lightning crackled through the room, and the earth itself seemed to shake beneath him. But despite the storm that raged in his heart, the betrayal had already been set in motion. Ogunlai, with a heavy heart, had ordered the guards to seize Shango and imprison him, fearing that the king's power had grown too dangerous to be left unchecked. In a final act of defiance, Shango was forced to flee the palace, leaving behind the empire he had built. The storm that had once been his ally now seemed to mock him as it raged through the skies. His enemies had won, and he, the mighty king, was reduced to an exiled fugitive. As Shango fled into the wilderness, the thunder and lightning continued to follow him, an ever-present reminder of the power he had lost and the destiny he had yet to fulfill. His heart was heavy with betrayal, but in his solitude, he knew that his journey was far from over. The storm inside him was not finished. It had only just begun to shape his true destiny. This was not the end of Shango's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would lead him through the darkest of times and eventually to the divine transformation he had always been destined for. The storm within him would not be quelled. It would rise to a crescendo, shaping the fate of Oyo and the very gods themselves. Exile had been a humbling experience for Shango. Once the proud ruler of Oyo, now a fugitive in the wilderness, he had lost everything: his throne, his empire, and the trust of his people. The storm inside him had not abated. If anything, it had grown stronger, more unpredictable. It raged in the heavens and within his very soul. For days, Shango wandered, consumed by grief and anger. Yet in the silence of the forest, far from the eyes of the court, he began to understand something deeper. His power, his fury, was not a curse. It was a gift, a divine force waiting to be unleashed. As the storm clouded his thoughts, the voice of the gods began to speak to him. In the stillness of the night, amidst the crackling of thunder, Shango could hear their whispers. They called him. They reminded him that he was not merely a man. He was the son of the heavens, chosen to wield the most powerful forces in nature. The gods had always known his potential, and now, it was time for him to embrace his true purpose. The divine transformation began slowly. At first, it was subtle, small signs that Shango's powers were growing. When he struck the ground in frustration, lightning would arc from his hands, setting fire to the dry leaves at his feet. When his heart grew heavy with sorrow, the wind would howl, and the trees would sway violently as if responding to his inner turmoil. But with each passing day, Shango felt his connection to the gods deepen, and his power began to align with the forces of thunder, lightning, and fire. It was as if the very elements had chosen him to be their vessel, their voice on earth. One night, as Shango stood on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the valley below, the storm inside him reached its peak. His rage, his sorrow, and his longing for revenge fused into a singular force. With a roar, Shango raised his arms to the sky. Thunder cracked through the heavens, and lightning flashed across the sky. The earth trembled beneath him as if acknowledging his divine transformation. In that moment, Shango was no longer a mortal king. He was a god, reborn in the storm. But as the thunder rumbled and the flames of his fury surged, Shango realized that this power was not just for destruction, it was also for balance. His rage, once a weapon to punish and conquer, was now a tool for justice. The storm that had once symbolized his anger now reflected the divine force within him, an unstoppable power that could both create and destroy, heal and punish. This was the true essence of Shango's divinity. With his newfound powers, Shango knew what he had to do. He could no longer hide in the shadows of the wilderness. His kingdom, his people, needed him. They needed the divine king who had once ruled with fire and thunder to return and restore order. The betrayal that had forced him into exile was now a distant memory, and Shango understood that his true destiny was far greater than revenge. It was about protecting the balance of nature, the balance of the world. As Shango made his way back to Oyo, the skies above him were filled with dark clouds, and the winds howled with anticipation. His return was inevitable. The storm had followed him every step of the way, and it now seemed to signal his divine purpose. The gods had granted him this power, and now it was time for him to fulfill his role as the protector and ruler of the world. The people of Oyo had heard the rumblings of thunder in the distance, but no one could have predicted the force of nature that was about to descend upon them. As Shango approached the gates of the city, the ground beneath him trembled. Lightning flashed in the sky, and the winds howled in fury. His presence was undeniable, and the people could feel the power radiating from him. The once mighty king had returned, not just as a ruler, but as a god. Shango's return was a moment of reckoning. His enemies, the ones who had betrayed him, could feel the power in the air. The storm had not just come for them. It had come to cleanse the land, to restore justice. As Shango entered the city, the thunder rumbled in the sky, as if announcing his return to his rightful place. He had come back not just to reclaim his throne, but to ascend to a higher plane of existence, a place among the gods. In that moment, Shango knew that his power was not only for his own glory. It was for the protection of his people, for the balance of the world. He was the god of thunder, lightning, fire, and war, and his journey to divinity had just begun. Shango's return to Oyo was nothing short of cataclysmic. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet as he strode into the city, the storm swirling around him with an intensity that mirrored his inner fury. Thunder crashed in the skies above, and lightning split the heavens, as though the world itself was reacting to the presence of the once exiled king. The people of Oyo, who had been living under the shadow of fear and uncertainty, felt an overwhelming surge of power as Shango approached. Their king had returned, but not as the mortal ruler they once knew. He had been transformed. The once proud king was now something greater. He was a god. His ascension was inevitable, and the storm that had followed him was not a mere display of anger, but a sign of his true divine nature. Shango, the god of thunder, lightning, fire, and war, was no longer just a king. He was a living embodiment of the forces of nature, a being whose very presence could command the skies and the earth. As Shango entered the gates of Oyo, the air seemed to crackle with energy. The city, once vibrant and bustling, now stood still in awe of the power that radiated from their ruler. The streets, once filled with the hustle and bustle of daily life, were now empty, save for the citizens who dared to witness the return of their god. The storm overhead was not a threat. It was a symbol of Shango's newfound role in the world. He had come to restore balance, to cleanse the land of the corruption and betrayal that had taken root during his absence. The betrayal that had forced Shango into exile was now nothing but a distant memory. His enemies, who had once conspired to dethrone him, now cowered in fear. They had not only underestimated the power of their king, but had also failed to see that he was destined for something far greater than any mortal throne. As Shango stood at the center of Oyo, his divine power radiating outward, the thunder and lightning crackling above him, his enemies knew they had no hope of defeating him now. Shango was no longer just a king. He was a god, and his return marked the beginning of a new era for Oyo. The people of Oyo, who had once feared the wrath of their king, now saw him as their protector, a divine figure sent from the heavens to guide them. His reign, once defined by fear and anger, was now one of divine justice. Shango's storm, once a symbol of his fury, had become a tool for balance and protection. His divine power allowed him to govern not through fear, but through the force of nature itself. The thunder that had once heralded his anger now symbolized his power to protect and defend, to punish those who would threaten his kingdom, and to restore peace. As Shango's influence spread across the land, his worship began to grow. Temples dedicated to him sprang up in every corner of Oyo, and his people looked to him not just as a ruler but as a divine protector. His image was carved into the stone of temples, his name spoken in reverence during rituals and ceremonies. The king who had once walked among his people as a mortal had become an orisha, a deity to be revered and honored. In time, Shango's legacy spread beyond the borders of Oyo. His story became known throughout the Yoruba-speaking kingdoms, and the people of Oyo passed down his teachings and his deeds. His worship spread to other parts of Africa, and in places far from his homeland, Shango became known as the god of thunder, war, and justice. His power extended beyond the confines of Oyo. It reached across the seas, to the Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian cultures, where Shango's name and image were adopted and revered in the religious practices of the people. Shango's rise to divinity was not just about power. It was about transformation. He had gone from being a mortal king to a god, from being a leader who ruled through fear to one who governed with divine wisdom and strength. His reign, now eternal, was a symbol of the balance between creation and destruction, between justice and wrath. His thunder, his lightning, and his fire were no longer destructive forces. They were tools of divine retribution, meant to restore harmony to the world. The storm that had once been a symbol of his anger was now a symbol of his legacy. A legacy that would continue to shape the world for generations to come. Shango's story, the story of a mortal king who became a god, became a cornerstone of Yoruba religion and culture. His name would forever be etched into the annals of history as one of the most powerful deities to ever walk the earth. And so, Shango's legacy lived on, not just as a king of Oyo, but as a god who ruled with the might of thunder, the fury of lightning, the heat of fire, and the justice of war. His journey had begun with betrayal, exile, and pain, but it had ended with divine ascension, and his reign would be remembered as one of the most powerful and just in all of history. The story of Shango, from mortal king to god of thunder, lightning, fire, and war, is a journey of transformation, power, and divine justice. His legacy continues to shape cultures and beliefs to this day. But this is only the beginning of our exploration into the ancient gods and their influence on humanity. If you found Shango's story fascinating, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic tales from the world of gods, myths, and ancient history. Have your say in the comments. What do you think of Shango's rise to divinity? And if you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends so we can spread these powerful stories together. Stay tuned for more gripping, educational, and dramatic stories about ancient gods that shaped the world as we know it.